Well, it seems like all hell is breaking loose. The Ukrainians just launched a missile attack against the Kursk nuclear power plant. We'll get an update on that. Meanwhile, Americans scrambling right now to get out of Lebanon. According to reports, they feel abandoned by the Biden administration as the U.S. is bracing for a wider war in Israel. Meanwhile, Iran just warned the United States a short time ago to stay out of this fight. Iran also telling the United States the restraints are off. Israel, meanwhile, for its part, is readying their response to Iran. And we're hearing reports this morning that Israeli IDF soldiers are being slaughtered in southern Lebanon. In that attack, is that attack on Lebanon backfiring right now? Let's make sense of all of this with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. A lot happening right now. Colonel, good to see you. First, you can take any one of these topics, but I think we need to start with what's happening in Lebanon and Americans trying to get out as we speak. Thousands of Americans trapped there.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, making sense out of any of this is a tall order, because the worse the situations get in these areas, the less coherence and the less rationality seems to play into all of this. The Ukrainians launched these missiles ostensibly as an act of desperation. You know, on the one hand, they don't care about Russian lives, and frankly, they don't care about the health of Europe. You destroy and potentially damage a nuclear power plant that has implications for a large region, a large part of the world. So it's a very dumb idea. But I think it is desperation. Now, the good news is the Russians report no radiation leaks. And others in the region who are monitoring it say they don't detect any radiation leaks. So that's good news. Second part is they say they've got it under control. They've secured it. The interesting part is that so many MLRS and ATACMS weapon systems, Army Tactical Missile System, rocket artillery, have been taken under fire and destroyed over the last several days by Iskander missiles. And those missiles are hypersonic. They carry a 1,500 to 1,800 pound warhead. They're very, very precise. That the whole region of eastern Ukraine has gone silent when it comes to these missiles. So I don't know what the missiles are, and it would be interesting to find out. I don't know if these are Shadows that were provided by the British or the French version called the Scout. Perhaps that's what hit the power plant. But it's very obvious that Ukraine is losing, and losing badly. The whole front is collapsing. The Russians are advancing deliberately because, of course, they have to be alert to mines and booby traps and things that may lie in their path. Large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers are surrendering. They are, of course, being treated well as always. They're actually calling the Russians once again and saying, hey, we're finished. We have nothing left. We're ready to surrender. So that part is good news. But what's really upsetting about this act of desperation is that it's designed, I am afraid, to do to us in Ukraine what Netanyahu is doing to us in the Middle East, and that is to drag in the United States and its allies into the war. Now, nothing bad happened per se, at least as far as we know from the Russian side. But I think we're going to see more of this in the near future. We're going to see it both in Ukraine and in Russia. And what has to happen right now in Ukraine is the president needs to shut down this regime. It's dangerous. This is a careless, irresponsible action that does not represent us, is not consistent with our views as a nation and as a people. That needs to be made clear to these people in Ukraine. And I think it's time to just shut them down. Say, we've had it with you. We're no longer going to support you. We're pulling out, because we don't want something like this to happen in the future and succeed.
So that's on the Russian front, and that's on what's just happened, this breaking news on this attack on this nuclear facility. Now let's turn to Lebanon, Colonel, where Americans trying to get out, upwards of 7,000 Americans trapped there who are trying to get out. The United States saying, yes, get out, but very difficult trying to get flights and trying to get these Americans out as Israel is expanding its war. This is not just a skirmish. We're hearing from the Israeli side that this is war. They are fully involved in a war in southern Lebanon at this hour. Where do things stand there before we talk about Iran? And the reports that I'm seeing this morning are showing, I'm seeing a lot, and you're not going to see this on Fox News. You're not going to see this on the major mainstream media. IDF soldiers coming up against heavy fire and being slaughtered in southern Lebanon. What's your sense of that?
Keep in mind that we do have a Marine Expeditionary Unit in the area, a total of almost 6,000 Marines. That MEU is normally an amphibious carrier, and they should be able to help evacuate people from Lebanon. Now, I don't know if that's being discussed or they've tasked the Marines to do something else, but normally I would think in such an emergency situation, that's why we maintain Marine Expeditionary Units in order to rescue American citizens from this kind of situation. I don't know what the likelihood is of flying out because I don't know who is willing to fly in and out of Lebanon. Remember, over the last few days, the Israelis have killed 7,000 people in and around Beirut. Not all of these people were associated, obviously, with Hezbollah, but that makes it very difficult for commercial airlines to fly in and pick people up. But it's a bad situation, and I don't know why we waited this long, because I think it's been pretty clear for some time now that Mr. Netanyahu was going to attack southern Lebanon. Now, as far as progress on the ground, we've got a huge problem right now, Clayton, with battle damage assessment of what actually is destroyed when explosives are used, when munitions are used, and also the casualty problem, because the Israelis have never told the truth about their losses. We've never had a clear picture of what's happened in Gaza. You have essentially a blackout for news of any kind about what happens on the front in Israel itself. They regard this as a national security matter. Fine. But the problem is when we say heavy losses, and I've been hearing the same thing from my sources, that in fact, when the special operations units went in first on the ground to try and quote unquote clear the way, they were unable to make very much progress. And in fact, many of them were severely wounded or killed. And then the troops that followed after them were subjected to the same kind of ambush tactics that the Israelis saw probably back in '82, only these may be actually worse depending upon the weapon systems they're using. But someone said to me, and this is now a day old, that 149 casualties had been taken by the Israelis. That may be true, and it may be now that it's up over 200. Have no idea. We know that the Israeli defense minister actually spoke to reporters who were asking about the ostensibly high number of Israeli casualties on the way into Lebanon. And he defended it by saying, no war in our history is as justified as this war that we're fighting now. And high losses are a cost of fighting this just war. Now, the last time the Israelis took something in the neighborhood of 2,000 plus casualties was in 1973 when they fought the Syrians and the Egyptians. I don't know what they're sustaining, but I suspect that if they haven't reached 2,000, they will shortly. Then you've got to also understand that Mr. Netanyahu has treated anyone who is not with him as a potential adversary. I know from some of the reports that I've seen that Russian bases were bombed by the Israeli Air Force in Syria.
In Syria, if you're a missile depot was struck, yes, by the Israelis in Syria.
Yeah, and if you're trying to minimize the numbers of people who are against you, that's not a good way to do business. And so Putin has essentially sent a message to Netanyahu, get out of Lebanon. And the other group that we haven't even mentioned, of course, are the Turks, because 1 million people have already fled Lebanon. And guess where they go? They flee to Turkey. And the Turks already have 3-4 million refugees living in their country as a result of the Syrian war. Now they're going to get more from Lebanon, and the foreign minister said that's unacceptable to us. And I'm getting the impression that the Turks are nearing the point where they're prepared to intervene militarily if the IDF will not end its operations in Lebanon. I see no evidence that the Israelis are going to do anything unless they are compelled to do so by an opponent.
That's on the Lebanon side. We haven't even touched on Iran yet, the other part of this massive question. The Iranians, as I mentioned at the top, now telling the United States, stay out of this, and also that we are removing the restraints. The gloves are off, essentially. They don't want war, they're telling the United States, but the restraints are off, the gloves are off. What will the Israeli response be to Iran? And what do you think the Iranian response will be to Israel at this stage? And where does the United States fit into all of this?
Well, first, let's look at the Israeli position right now. They have not yet responded, which is interesting. I say it's interesting because if the Iranian strike was as light and essentially strategically irrelevant as the Israelis claim, I'm surprised they haven't already launched some sort of retribution strike. Now, I don't have, again, the battle damage assessment. I'm not privileged. I don't get to go in and look at the satellite photography. I'm told that the strike that Iran launched of about 180 missiles, some of which were hypersonic, actually damaged airfields and aircraft. Now, there were some reports about having destroyed or damaged F-35s. I have no way of knowing that. There were also claims that they'd hit F-16s. But the fact that the Israelis haven't responded very quickly, especially with their Air Force, does suggest that the Iranians must have had some impact in that area, because the Israelis are almost entirely dependent on the Air Force. In fact, that's one of the reasons the Iranians have made it very clear they know where the aircraft are and they're going to target them, because without air support, close air support for the Israeli army on the ground, they're probably not going to get very far in Lebanon. And the Israelis know that. Now, what is Iran's response? Iran is simply saying, that's it. We've had it. The Iranians have been listening, as everybody in the Middle East has been listening, to Vladimir Putin and secondarily President Xi. And their counsel has been repeatedly, don't act rashly, exercise restraint. Don't give any reason for someone to go to war against you. And they've listened to this, and they've now concluded that this restraint hasn't worked. I'm sure you must have seen the reports that we, apparently through our representatives on the ground over there, told Hezbollah that we were ready for a negotiated ceasefire with Hezbollah. And that was one of the reasons that meeting was held. And of course, that meeting was identified, found, and targeted by our capabilities. Without our active participation, without our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, our electronic capabilities, the Israelis could not carry off something on the scale that you saw in Beirut recently against Hezbollah. So everybody knows that. I mean, it's not a secret. It may be a secret to the American people that we're that involved, but everybody else in the region knows it, and so does President Putin. And I think they've said now, that's it. We're not going to exercise any more restraint. And we have the capability to deliver punishing strikes. I've seen estimates that at least for 4 or 5 days, Iran could launch 100 missiles an hour against Israel. Now, I don't know if they'll do that, but that's a potential. We also know that the Israelis know, or the Iranians know, where the Israelis will go. They are very suspicious of Cyprus. And that's why Erdogan has made comments about Cyprus. Don't try to use it as a launch pad against Hezbollah. If you do that, we'll become involved. We don't want Israeli aircraft in Cyprus. So I think that's one. There's another one, though, and that's Azerbaijan. People don't hear much about Azerbaijan in public, but Azerbaijan has been providing oil to the Israelis through Turkey. And Erdogan has allowed this oil to move without interruption into Israel. That could end very soon because the Turkish population is furious and wants it stopped. And I think the Azeri Turks, whatever their dislikes may be of Iran, are probably equally sensitive to this. But the Azerbaijanis, remember, were supported in their last war with Armenia by the Israelis. The Israelis actually helped the Azeris with unmanned aircraft, in other words, drones, to kill Armenians. That wasn't very popular in Russia. Russia has historically supported the Armenians, but the Armenian government has moved in this sort of globalist direction and made itself something of a puppet of Washington. But the Iranians know that the Israelis, if they want to, have been given license to go into Azerbaijan, where they can set up, they can refuel, and then launch strikes against Iran from Azerbaijan. I don't know what the plans will be, but I suspect that if that's under consideration and the Israelis try to do it, that Azerbaijan will be drawn into the war, unless, of course, Erdogan, who's very close with the Azeri Turks in Azerbaijan, intervenes to stop it. So there's a tinderbox now that is primed to explode. Every conceivable weapon you can imagine, up to nuclear weapons, is available to everybody. And those weapons are going to be used. And Israel is a very small country, and they've concentrated much of their population in the center of the country. The Israelis are going to take terrible losses. And this has always been my concern from the very beginning. And there's been a tendency to treat everyone in the region, Arabs, Turks, Persians, with contempt, as though they're some sort of backwater. There's no human capital. There's no sophistication. There's no technology. Well, that is wrong. And we're going to get an education the hard way very shortly. And I think it's going to be the death knell of Israel. That's how concerned I am. Now, the Israelis, of course, have nuclear weapons. Would they use it? I think there are circumstances under which, yes, they would use it. That should be of great concern to us.
With 10,000 American forces sitting there in that region, if they decide that there's an existential threat to their existence, launching nuclear weapons against Iran, against Syria or other targets, that should be of great concern to the United States. It's a good thing, though, that we've got great leadership in the White House with Kamala Harris, and I feel very good about the leadership that they're going to be able to navigate through this tinderbox right now. Final word, Colonel.
Yeah. Well, in a sane world, the President of the United States would intervene and essentially pull the plug on Kyiv completely. Say, that's it. You've had your shot. This is unacceptable. We're pulling out, which would end the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, frankly. And secondly, he would immediately turn to Netanyahu and say, you've got 48 hours to put together a negotiating strategy to end this conflict. And we'll help you, we'll assist you. But if you fail to do that, if you insist on this course where you're trying to continue the expulsion or killing of the population in Gaza, where you're going to continue harassing, brutalizing the population on the West Bank with the goal of ultimately throwing them out, if you're going to continue with this invasion in Lebanon with the goal of destroying not just Hezbollah, but bringing Lebanon as a country to heal or leave it in ruins, if you are going to continue to strike targets in Syria, Iraq, and then ultimately Iran, then we will leave you and you will be on your own. But you see, that would be a president who had a clear, unambiguous picture of our true national interests. We have no interest in a war with Russia. We have no national interest in a war with Iran, or for that matter, anybody else in the Middle East. We should be interested in the opposite. But both Zelensky and Netanyahu are interested in dragging us into their conflicts. It needs to stop.
You want more of that, and you can read the message and the mission over at Our Country, Our Choice. Go to ourcountryourchoice.com. The Colonel is the CEO of ourcountryourchoice.com, and watch his mission video over there, Operation Focus, focusing on America, putting America's security first. It's high time people pay attention to that. Colonel, great to see you as always. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Clayton. Appreciate it.